In this video, I'm going to go through the workflow of editing R3D raw footage inside DaVinci Resolve. So if you've shot some footage on the new Nikon ZR or any other RED capable camera, Resolve has plenty of tools that make it fairly simple. So let's get into it. Alright, so now we're in Resolve, and I'm going to assume that you've already imported your clip and dropped it into a timeline. And the clip I'm going to work on today is something I shot in Tiger Beach at sunset of a tiger shark and a reef shark swimming through the scene. And I picked this scene because it has a ton of dynamic range. We've got the darks of the ocean floor and corals, as well as the highlights of the sun rays coming through the water. Alright, to start, I like to find a point in the video that kind of represents the main focal point of the clip. So I'm going to choose kind of right there, and I'm going to go over to the color page. In the color page, we're going to start in the camera raw tab, which is the first camera icon here in the toolbar. And you'll see that all of our options are grayed out. So to change that, we're going to go to this drop-down menu and choose decode using clip. And you'll see that all of these options now become available to us. Now, if all you wanted to do was just convert this to Rec 709, it's pretty easy to do in this tab alone. You can just go down to your color space, choose Rec 709 and BT 1886, and you'll get a Rec 709 conversion and all the available tools like your exposure adjustment and white balance options, as well as your ISO and tone map and highlight roll off, which is very useful. However, if you want to do some more in-depth grading, we're going to have to work with some nodes up here. So to start that, we're going to reset this camera raw tab and keep everything here as it is. Now up here in our node tree, I'm going to hit Option S and add a few nodes. And then on the last node, I'm going to go up to my effects tab and type in color space transform and add that to the last node, and then go to my first node and add it there as well. Now the best way and the most flexible way to edit this footage is to convert it from the red log into DaVinci wide gamut. So to do that, we're going to take our color space and gamma curve that our footage is already in and convert it into DaVinci wide gamut. So we'll go to that first color space transform, and in the input color space, press R for red, scroll down to red wide gamut RGB, and in the input gamma, also hit R again and select red log 3G10. Then in our output color space, hit D for DaVinci wide gamut, and the output gamma D again for DaVinci intermediate. Then we're going to go to our last node, the other color space transform, and we're going to take it from DaVinci wide gamut to Rec 709. So input color space D DaVinci wide gamut, and input gamma DaVinci intermediate. And then for the output color space, R for Rec 709, and our output gamma is going to be gamma 2.4. So now essentially what's happening is we've converted it from the red log footage to DaVinci wide gamut. We're going to make all of our edits here inside the DaVinci wide gamut color space, and then we're going to finally take it from the DaVinci wide gamut to Rec 709. So all of our edits are going to happen in here. Now the biggest advantage of using R3D raw video or any raw video is that you can change the exposure and white balance after the fact. So to do that, we're going to go back to the camera raw tab, and we're going to mess around with the white balance and exposure. This is underwater footage, which usually pushes the white balance quite a bit. So I already know that I'm going to want to max out my color temp to make it super warm, and then just add in some magenta until I feel like the image is balanced. This will be different for your clip depending on your depth and visibility, but for this clip, I think around there looks good. Now for the exposure, you can adjust it using this slider here, or you can just go over to the ISO tab and change the ISO as if you had changed it in camera, which is pretty cool. I know that this was shot at sunset, so I want it to be slightly underexposed. So I'm going to go for ISO 500. Now I'm going to go back up into my nodes and label these so that I know what I'm doing. So I'm going to start off with a white balance node, an exposure node, contrast, saturation, and a hue adjustment. Now there's a ton of ways that you can set up these nodes, and this is by no means the perfect solution, but for a basic adjustment and this tutorial, this is going to get you most of the way there. So even though we changed the white balance here, I can still see that there's some changes that need to be made, but I can't make them by just adding in more magenta. So I'm going to go to my white balance node and adjust it there. When I change my white balance, I always want to make sure this node is under the linear gamma. And I'm going to go into my primary color wheels and adjust the gain. I like to use the vector scope to try and get this a little bit more even and centered in the circle. Just going to take my gain and just kind of add in some of that warmth and red back into my footage. You can see that we're losing a lot of saturation and color. However, we're getting a much more even image. Somewhere around there looks good. All right, next I'm going to adjust my contrast. And you're going to see that as we add in more contrast, we're also going to add in saturation. And I feel like that's the most natural way to add in saturation is through contrast. So I'm going to be using my HDR wheels and my curves. And I'm going to start by adding in a little bit of contrast using the HDR wheel. Not much. And then I'm also going to use the curves. And you can see by just those two adjustments, we've added in contrast as well as saturation. Now, I still think that there is some saturation to be added. So I'm going to go over to my saturation node. And again, I don't like to use the saturation slider. I find that it adds too much color to the image globally, so the color boost is another good option. And this will just saturate all of the most desaturated colors. Just going to add in a little bit of color boost. You can see that that brought back a lot of our color. All right, so I think this is already looking pretty good, but I'm going to see what I can do for the blue color of the water. So I'm going to go into my hue node and over in my curves, we're going to go to the hue versus hue. And I'm going to select the blue of the water. And then I want to grab my two dots on the sides and feather out that selection. And I think that the water is looking a little purple. So I'm just going to change this slightly to a bit more of a blue color, somewhere around there. And then I'm going to go into my hue versus saturation, and again, pick the blue water, feather out my selection quite a bit, and add in some saturation. You can see it's subtle, but the before was just a little bit too purple. And now it's much more naturally blue. Cool. So from here, I'm going to change my vector scope to my waveform graph. And you can see here that our highlights, where that sun's coming through, is clipping a bit. The best thing about RAW is that we can bring those highlights back. So to do that, I'm going to go into my exposure node, and in the HDR wheels, I'm going to hit this little icon over here twice and go to specular. Now if I click this sun, I can see what specular is affecting, and it's affecting only the brightest parts of the image. So I'm going to start by bringing the exposure of the brightest parts of my image down. And you can see in the scopes, in the waveform, that there's a little bit of that image that is being brought down. Now, if we wanted to make that selection bigger, we could take this slider and let it affect more of the darker parts. I think it's a little bigger, somewhere around there. And we're going to start bringing those highlights down, before and after. Here we could also adjust the color temperature of those highlights. So again, we could either do that in the specular and affect those, or in the highlights, we could also change that color by just pushing it a little bit to the warmer tones, but making sure it's not too green. So something like that. Again, I think this is looking pretty good for the most part. I do remember it being a little bit darker than this because it was at sunset, so I'm going to go back and just add in a little bit more contrast to my scene just to finish it off. Just going to drop the blacks a little bit, just like that. And I think that's looking pretty good. I might go back into my white balance tab and just add a little bit of warmth to the shadows. Again, you can click this button up here in the top left corner of each wheel and see what you're about to affect. So yeah, in the shadows wheel, I'm just going to grab that center point and pull it ever so slightly to the left to add in a bit of warmth. It's super subtle. You can really only see it in the darks here, but I think it does add a little bit more to the image. All right, here's the before and the after. All right, so this was a super quick breakdown of how to edit R3D footage inside DaVinci Resolve. Again, there's tons of ways to do this, but this is what I've found to be the fastest way and the most beginner-friendly way. So if you have any questions, you can drop them down in the comments below or shoot us an email to ikelite@ikelite.com.